welcome one of the most significant contributors to the WordPress Melbourne community and our emergency entrant for Australia's Got Talent, Dee Teal.
Thanks, Pete. Hey guys, tonight, thank you for coming. I realise that Docklands can be a little bit of a challenge. You guys made it and found us, so full marks. Tonight's talk is a quick view of Multisite, or what it can do, and the things to think through when you're approaching a project that you think might benefit from Multisite, but you're not quite sure. But before then, this is me. I'm a front-end dev, actually moving more into project management these days. Specialised in Genesis, organised stuff around here, and I'm currently working with XWP. And if you want to know more about them, come and see me. And actually, though I call myself the web princess, I'm not really much of a princess at all. So Multisite is functionality built into WordPress core that gives you the opportunity to run multiple different virtual sites from that single WordPress installation. This gives you some fantastic benefits. Managing multiple sites and only having to install and update themes and plugins once, running with a single core base of users and doing this all from a single dashboard. There are numerous different reasons that people install and use Multisite, and as someone who's used it in some of these ways, I'm going to tell you tonight how great Multisite is, but I'm also going to give you the inside track on where you should use it and maybe where you shouldn't. But first, here's some examples of sites that are using Multisite. This is the biggest, baddest WordPress multi-site. It's WordPress.com. It's a single installation powering millions of sites and blogs. So if anyone asks you, can multi-site scale? The answer is yes. Now there's obviously a huge amount of stuff going on under the hood, but at its core, it's a core WordPress installation. This is BBC America. This is a multi-site. So it has each of the different shows has their own sub-site in that network. This is the New York Times. Predictably, it's a seriously high traffic site, and this is the New York Times' blogs. This is not the New York Times paper itself, but this is the blogs that run out of that. They have a fairly customized installation that makes their site an app in a much bigger framework, but the site is at its core a multi-site installation. You see quite a lot of universities using Multisite because they have large numbers of different kind of faces for their different sections. So you'll see this is Mary Washington's parent site, but then here's the Student Union site, which is part of that same network, but is running a completely separate or different section for that multi-site for the Student Affairs Department. This is the biggest multi-site that I've worked on. News Corp moved 15 of their mastheads from a commercial CMS to WordPress. It was a process that took about 18 months that finished in January of this year. These are all hosted on WordPress VIP, so they're, again, not so much different, but got different considerations around it, but they are, again, at their core a multi-site. So this is the Herald Sun, of course, the Geelong Advertiser, Fox Sports now runs on WordPress as well, and news.com.au. These have all had, again, a little bit like the New York Times one, the News Corp ones are running within a much bigger framework of a whole lot of conjoined products, pulling stuff in together. But yeah, the backbone is WordPress. And then this one. This is a smaller network of connected websites. This is for the Christian Youth Camps of Victoria. This is the parent site that tells you information about their organisation, but they have 6 different campuses that you can hire out. And so each of those campuses has their own website. This is running a single WordPress theme that is colour changing for each of the different sites, predictably, as this is one that I built. It's built on Genesis. But there are 6 different sites, all with different colour schemes. So you can see that all of them look like very, very separate and distinct, but they are all part of that same network. So there's one login, and I can log in and administer any one of those sites in that network. So those are sites that are using Multisite. Let's have a little bit of a look at what's different about Multisite behind the actual scenes. To start off, there are essentially 2 ways that you can set up the structure of your Multisite, either as subfolders or subdomains. With a subfolder set up, the name of your site is appended to the root domain, as if there was another WordPress install in a subfolder. This is all virtual. This is not actually a subfolder, but this is what it would actually look like. Subdomains are trickier to set up. It requires some DNS work to make that happen, but their appeal is that they're also able to be remapped to other domains. Which is what you see happening in WordPress.com. You can get your free MySite, .wordpress.com domain when you just sign up and fill in, set up a WordPress.com install. But then you can use DNS to actually remap to something completely different, so you can have your own domain mapping to that. Now, because of this capability, it's possible to set up Multisite as a hosting platform, and my first introduction to it was actually seeing someone do that, and I got quite excited about it, and I went home and I set up this great installation, and I was selling my hosting to my clients at a certain rate per month, and I was managing it all from Multisite. In the long term, it wasn't the most fabulous idea, even though it was possible. It's probably not the best use. Well, it's definitely not the best use of Multisite. And it was only a year or two later that I was basically having to disentangle each of those websites and put them on their own standalone installations. And we'll kind of cover in the things to think about when you're actually looking at Multisite and why that was actually the case. So in the example to follow, we're using the CYC as the example. We're using subdomains. That was because that was what the client already had. We didn't want to have to go through any hassle around changing domains and messing up with their SEO. If you ask me which is better, the answer is it depends. But right now I'm not qualified to dive too deep into why one is better than the other. My recommendation is that you do your due diligence about that and find out which is best for you, because that turns into an SEO conversation, and that's absolutely not my wheelhouse. So here's what's different in the dashboard. Anyway, it doesn't. Oh, look, there is a little red dot. You can see up here, there's this My Sites link. We've got Upgrade Network that is different than what you would normally see. And you can see that you can't actually access pages and posts in there because this is the network admin screen. This isn't actually administrating a website as such. Here's a look at the list of sites that we have in this network. We can see when each site was last updated, when it was registered, how many users are on the site, and the elements of the site that are being indexed. Actually, that index stuff over here, that's provided by a plugin because we're indexing all of the sites so that we can search across the site. But this is, all the rest of it is stuff that you would see naturally when you actually install. Here we can see that my user, CYC admin, has super user status. I'm a super admin. This is the one user to rule them all. I'm the only user who can install plugins and themes. And as this is a closed site, I can also add or delete sites. I'm Dee the Powerful in this scenario. Even admins can't do this stuff. They can only administer the sites that they've been given admin status on. Only the super admin can administer the whole network. And you can have more than one super admin, but this is not something that you give away lightly because when somebody is a super admin, they have way more power than a normal user, and there is massive potential to, what's the word, screw things up. I'll do the polite word, seeing as this has been recorded. So, but yes, massive power comes massive responsibility. So in the theme options, all of the themes installed on the network are visible. They can be activated network-wide, so you activate one theme and it's available to all of the sites in the network, or you can leave them disactivated at this point and then activate them from within your site and have them just available for single sites. If we were using different themes on each site, we could leave them disabled in the network but installed and then enable them one by one. In this case, we haven't needed to. We have one theme that's ruling everything, so we've got the sample theme because we've got more, there's one site that's doing something different within this network. We're not focusing on that. And 2015, I always leave that there for testing. So the same is true with the plugins. We can network enable them so that they're available to everybody, or we can enable them individually on each site. But all the plugins in the network will show up in this list. So if you log in, if you're working on one of the child sites and you log in, you will see all of the plugins that are available. You just won't be able to add or edit them. If you're not careful when you're running a network like this, this list can get quite out of hand, particularly if you've got people, asking for functionality, wanting to add bits and pieces, wanting to add a new thing. It can get quite long and challenging to look after. So again, we'll cover shortly some of the things around users and plugins when you're actually running a network, but it's something to be aware of. So moving away from the network admin, we can see the list of sites in the toolbar under My Sites. Those are the list of sites that are there. We can navigate to manage any of those sites from this point. Predictably, as a super user, I have access to all of them, but only those people within each venue who have admin access can only access the venues that they're allowed to. So we have a couple of users that manage more than one website, so they've got 2 venues that they're looking after. We have a bunch of other users who only access one. So when they log on, all they'll be able to see is actually the site that they're allowed to edit. And once you navigate to the child site, the admin area, everything looks pretty much as you'd expect. You can update and edit your site as usual. Now you can see, okay, yeah, so this business as usual, pretty straightforward. So now that you can see what it can do, if you're anything like me, you're desperate to try it out. But before you do, it pays to do some good hard thinking about what it is you really want to achieve that you think you should use Multisite for. So here's the question, when do you use Multisite? And this is the answer. In fact, it's pretty much the only answer. When the data is disconnected and the user base is shared. We're going to break it down into some more kind of categories, and here's pretty much a checklist to ask yourself when you're considering whether or not Multisite is a good option for the project you've been asked to consider. We called it the pre-flight checklist. So here's the first question. Is this project about building a network of linked websites? Maybe with different kinds of content, maybe different users, different needs, but does the buck stop with the site owner? So if you think about WordPress.com, the site itself, the platform, the network, the infrastructure is owned by Automatic. They give you a place to build and grow your site, and while you own the content, the place where it lives belongs to them. Is that the kind of environment that you or your client is looking for? Is the site owner equipped to look after it, prepared to pay you to look after it? And for the higher tier hosting multi-site needs, are they prepared to pay for that as well? Seriously, this is not something that you would put on a shared environment. It can be resource heavy, particularly as the network grows. So the question behind the question is actually this: is the network owner prepared to have the responsibility, and do they have the resources to be responsible for everybody's sites? Is the number of users they're going to be managing going to be something they're prepared to support? And if they're not, get everyone on their own hosting and set the network owner up with Infinite WP or Managed WP or some other kind of site management protocol or Jetpack to manage each site from a single destination. Does the user data for each site need to be isolated from the other sites? So this speaks to the issue of hosting small sites in a single multi-site and the data security integrity issue involved. So if you're creating a network or you've got a series of sites, the user information lives in one table of the database. So if there was a breach, that information is available to one and all. It's not, all of the data of the website lives in its own separate tables, except that one section. The user data is all stored together. So if you've got somebody that's setting up and adding lots of users to their site, they've got some subscribers to their site, it means that theoretically somebody else within that network could be able to see that data, which presents challenges with regards to privacy and all of that kind of information. So if you are able to tick that box and say the user data for each site needs to be isolated, then you should be rethinking how you're actually going to do that project rather than diving in and using multi-site. Could the things that you're trying to do be done by using custom post types or categories? You can have completely different templates for each custom post type or each archive category. So think carefully about what you're trying to achieve by making your sites into a network, if a more lightweight way could actually work instead. Are the sites all going to look the same? If every single subsite is going to be exactly the same except for the content, but the content is all written the same way, you don't need multi-site. Replicating the theme and settings on every single subsite is actually a pain in the neck. And it's possible to achieve the same results with categories, tags, and CPTs. You just have to think about your architecture a little bit differently. If you were ever that person who started out on WordPress.com and then you got frustrated because you couldn't add plugins or you couldn't get the premium theme that you wanted to make your site look like you wanted, and you started to chafe at some of the controls that WordPress.com puts around you, you'll know the pain that your users will feel when they're wanting to do things on your network. So will your users want that functionality? Will your users want to be able to add plugins and add themes? Will you be comfortable saying no? And if not, put them on their own site, on their own hosting. Same for themes and plugins. Yeah, so any kind of fancy behavior like the JS, or I've actually got my things around the wrong way. But if you've been on WordPress.com, you've ever tried to paste a snippet into a widget area only to see it disappear, you'll know this frustration. If your users are going to be needing any of these kinds of functionality, adding in your own code snippets and stuff like that, then multi-site will frustrate them. And there are plugins you can give people that access, but honestly, why would you do that? You're opening your whole network up to an enormous amount of risk from users that don't know what they're doing. So again, if you're going to want to give people that kind of access, then you should be rethinking how you're actually doing it. Multi-sites are virtual. They're all part of the whole. So FTP for individual sites is impossible. You'd have to give someone access to the whole site. And I'm pretty sure you don't need me to tell you that that would be really risky. So if they need FTP access, then you need to rethink what you're doing. So this is kind of the list of all of the things that you shouldn't do. All of the reasons not to use multi-site or to think of other ways of doing it. So as soon as you've ticked any of those boxes, you should probably think twice about using multi-site. It is awesome. It has a learning curve. It's a huge responsibility and it's incredibly powerful. And as you've seen from the examples, it can be put to excellent use in the right context. So even after me trying to talk you out of it in that sense, and you're still sure you want to use it because none of these boxes apply to you, where do you start? First of all, avoid shared hosting. So you need to look at hosting and how you're going to manage this. Some kind of virtual cloud service, something that's going to scale as your site scales is the best option for you. So start with your hosting and where you're going to look after it. Get really, really familiar with doing manual backups because particularly when you have a situation where, if one of the CYC venues decided to sell one and then they were wanting to remove one of those sites from that network, it's actually easier to do that manually than it is to do it with a plugin. There's not a great many plugins that will handle multi-site, and certainly not many that will be able to withdraw one and put it somewhere else. So get really comfortable doing manual backups and migrations. Certainly if you're developing locally, setting up multi-site locally is definitely possible. I had CYC running on MAMP and had that working fine. And when you get to the point where you're having to move that to your staging or your test server before you even go to move it to live, the only way that I found it successful to actually move all of that stuff around was actually doing manual backups. So get comfy doing that. I think everybody should be comfy doing that anyway, but if you're not, that's a good place to start. Be vigilant about the plugins that you use, and don't forget to check when you're buying a premium plugin that it does actually have support for multi-site. I've been caught out on that one, going, this is going to do exactly what I want, and then you go to install it and it's like, oh yeah, it doesn't support multi-site, oops. And then version control is really, really, really a good idea when you're doing stuff like this. In fact, it's a good idea all of the time. And here's where the information lives. On the codex, the first questions before you create a network, then how to create the network, and these will all be in my slides, which of course we'll give you links to. Those are all basically on WordPress.org. There's a couple of, in actual fact, there's a blog post by Mika Epstein about not using multi-site. Some of the information, there's quite a lot that was of information that I shared today that is also on her site. So that's worth having a look at too if you're still on the fence about whether or not you need it. And here are some external resources. WPMU Dev have done a lot of work, have a lot of plugins for Multisite. And so often you'll find if you're looking for a particular plugin to do a particular thing, these guys will have probably already done it already, so they're worth checking out from that perspective. And this is where you get to ask me any questions, and I will endeavour to have the answers, or if you may have answers as well. Have at it.
You said with manual backup, you said you've got to inside you look at one database. How do you back up this database content of the one side?
I would.
Database you put the whole lot into it.
So the question was, if you have a database that's got multiple tables, how do you just back up one site rather than backing up all of them? I'm always keeping a backup of all of them. I'm not keeping backup of those individual sites separately. So, and actually I am using a plugin for backups. I'm using Updraft Plus, which has a multi-site add-on. So having a backup it doesn't matter that they're all still together because I'm keeping the network together. So if I was at a point where I was wanting to migrate a single site out of that, then I would export the relevant tables from PHPMyAdmin and then import them into a new installation. The thing with that is that you have to have your new installation first because you can export the user table, but because the user table has everybody else's data in it, you don't want to do that. So you set the WordPress installation up first, and then you import those tables that are specific to that website.
Out of your, I think 30 or so plugins in that multi-site installation, which did you find, like, what's your top 2 or 3 that were most helpful in the multi-site?
In the multi-site context, it's all going to come down to what you actually want to do.
Is there any like 3 that you wouldn't do a multi-site without? Like, is there any that you would be like, oh, at a minimum, these are any plugins that are kind of like a minimum on a multi-site, or is that still just kind of...
Again, it's all just going to, there's no plugins that I'm sitting in there. I'm putting this in there because it's a multi-site and a multi-site needs this. The plugins that I'm using ACF because of, there's a whole lot of custom data that I'm using throughout. So, that pretty much goes in every site that I do. So it's not multi-site specific. So some of the functionality that these guys wanted was that they wanted to be able to search the whole network from the parent site, so they can put in a search, which meant indexing the whole database. And WPMU Dev have a plugin that does all the indexing, and then they have other plugins that kind of plug into that to actually display the data how you want to use it. The other thing that they wanted to be able to do was share documents, and again, WPMU had a plugin that actually meant that you could upload documents to your media library, and you could actually access the parent media library from elsewhere. There's a plugin in there that actually, which was really useful actually. I would probably reuse this one again, particularly because of the nature of that network. If I go back, so that menu across the top is the primary menu for the parent site for cyc.org.au, but we've reused it in the child sites as well. So there's a really little plugin that Ron Rennick wrote that actually made that possible, so that we're actually pulling the custom menu from the previous site. So that one was actually really, really useful. But yeah, again, all of those, any plugins that we're putting in are always going to be about what's the functionality that it's going to provide to the client. Updraft is probably one that I would use because that has multi-site support for backups. And it's the data that you get from Updraft is data that you would have to import into a site manually. So again, if you're using that for backing up, then you do need to know how to do a manual install or migrate. Yep.
Sorry.
Don't apologise.
Just on a management side of things, in business, like, do you actually support all the different users for all the different websites, or do you support the network owner and they support the
that's all going to come down to the kind of maintenance agreement that you have with the client. These guys pay me on a retainer every month, and so I'm looking after everything, because the guy who's essentially the network owner or who runs CYC organisation in Victoria, he's not a web dev. He just, he's trying to prod his team to do more marketing, to do more stuff, but none of these guys, they're event organisers, they're venue managers, they're not web heads. So I'm looking after all of it, and they pay me every month to do that. And you get various traction. I mean, one of the guys in the team's actually quite excited about it, and so he's quite happy to jump in and tinker and update pages and do bits and pieces. Other guys, one of them's too scared to even post a photo to Instagram, and is just not sure about how that works and not sure that he can see the benefit of it. So that's going to come down from client to client. Now these guys, there's only about 8 users in the whole network. And pretty much if they've got issues, then they'll actually direct it to the network manager, and he's the one that I talk to. I'm not sitting talking to each and every one of them, though I have had conversations with them at various points.
Because that's quite important. I've actually had experience with this type of thing where you sort of outline that you're dealing with the owner of the web, one person, and then dealing with 25 users.
Yeah.
And you end up dealing with 25 users.
Yeah, then I would be writing that into the contract.
Yeah, and not getting paid.
No, writing into that in the contract so that you get paid for supporting 25 users. Yeah. That becomes part of the conversation you have with the client when you hand that over and go, this is what I'm doing. Yes, I'm prepared to support the users, or no, I'm not. And that becomes part of the handover.
I think that's really important. Selling that to someone that knows the cost.
Yeah.
Not just set up and...
Not set and forget. Well, I hope that for most of us that are doing this kind of thing, none of us are really doing the set and forget thing. In the long term, that would, for your ongoing business, there's a lot of people that do, or a lot of clients who go, I only want to pay so much. Anyway, that's not a multi-site conversation. Nina?
When you access the files via FTP or whatever, can you separate the sites better? Can you check
The uploads directory will break things up in folders per site, so you can see the files in each one. But yeah, it's not a whole there's not a whole folder that you can say this is the island.cyc or this is. So you kind of have to know which number in the network it is, and then you go, okay, so I can see that those are the uploads for there. But yeah, it is a single WordPress installation, and so it takes a little while to kind of find your way around some of those things. Okay, so I think I have got time for one more question.
Can you get the parent site to be like a custom post type or an archive of all the other content?
Yeah, there's plugins. Again, WPMU have got plugins that will pull content, and a lot of times they do it with RSS. But there are things that will kind of break down some of those walls to actually share some of that content across. If that's kind of what you're doing, then I ask the questions, is multi-site the right thing in that situation? If what you're wanting to do is, yes, it is possible, I'd be looking at what the benefits of that are. Anyway, I have spoken long enough. I will hand it back to Mr. Wilson, who's going to introduce our next speaker. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dee. Who was the idiot who recommended multi-site?
I wasn't going to name any names because I didn't want him to feel awkward or uncomfortable or to blush heavily.
I'm glad I'm not that idiot.
I'm so glad it's not you too.
So next up we have got James Bundy, who is presenting a talk titled The Often Useful and Somewhat Annoying World of WordPress Multisite. James is a digital marketing consultant running his own agency, Creative Approach. He's been building with WordPress for around about 5 years. In his spare time, he used to spend his time DJing in clubs. Now, one day, he hopes to be able to drop some wicked beats at his son's birthday party. Please put your hands together for James.
Basically today I was going to talk about, I suppose, my experience coming from a digital agency with multi-site, really covering sometimes when we find it useful, but a lot of the time where I find it rather annoying. So first things first, I will give you some background. Peter's pretty much told you everything you need to know about myself. I've actually been developing with WordPress for 6+ years. We build a lot of custom websites for clients. So pretty much everything we do is a custom build. We use WordPress for a lot of that stuff. We also manage a lot of multi-site websites or WordPress installations on an ongoing basis. We've got quite a few that we look after. Some are quite small, some are rather large. I suppose probably the biggest one we deal with is we look after Netball Australia. So we deal with their national site or their national team site and all of their state sub-sites. And basically what I wanted to sort of talk, and some of the bits I will talk about will sort of probably touch on what Dee has already talked about, is like really, why multi-site in the first place? And sort of one of the, the pros, and Dee's already covered quite a few of these, is it is one core WordPress installation. It does simplify management because everything is in that one control via that one dashboard in regards to plugins. It is very scalable, but ultimately the sites can really run independently of each other. So pretty much we look upon all those things as a pro for why we want to use it. But then really the cons are pretty much all the pros. The one core WordPress installation, it's a lot of risk involved. And if I'm honest, I crap myself anytime we make an upgrade to a massive installation. It's just awful. It's a horrible, horrible experience, and I hate it every time we do it. The one dashboard can lead to a lot of issues. I call it death by plugin. We did take over management of one multi-site installation. It had 86 plugins installed. I think of them we had 3 sliders. Can't be enough sliders. There was, I think, 4 on there that shared posts between or could allow you to change the class. And it's like, because basically everyone had gone in there and done crazy things. It becomes really, really taxing with killing their server constantly. Scalability, it's really great, but again, it can become really big quickly. And when it gets big, it gets hard to manage. And again, we've got a multi-site installation. I think it's about 7 to 8 gig, which makes it really, 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 really hard to manage and work with. And you've got to be really careful with that. Once you open this thing up and you can scale it, people go crazy and sort of get a bit mad with these things. And also, when I say the sites are independent of each other, they are, but they're really not at the same time because everything's pulling on those same resources. So you've got to be really, really careful making sure you haven't got one particular site that's really, really resource heavy there that's going to sort of like damage the others. Because if one's pulling all the resources for the site and you've got crap hosting, it's going to destroy every single site you've got on there at the same time. So where is it a winner? So typical scenarios where we would normally use it for people is generally a large client that has numerous child companies and they're looking for individual sites for all of those small companies with that one parent. We would look at ones that have a site but want region-specific ones. So the site actually might be very, very consistent, but they might want one hosted, one that's US-centric, one for Australia, one for Europe, where really the core of the site's very similar, but they want it to have its own unique domain and they want to be able to post news items and content that's specific to that region. Generally on something like that, we would actually host it. We would host it more in a central region like Europe or somewhere, rather than hosting it here for something like that. Also, it's quite good in that regards to people that want translated sites that actually have a team that want to take the whole site and then retranslate it. And that's a really good way you can do it as well for that. So another way we do use it for, and it sort of goes against what Dee was saying a bit, we do use it for clients that want to share the same information across those sites. And I'll explain a few plugins that you can use and ways you can do that. So in instances where you have a company that has a parent and has a lot of child companies to it, they might want to have individual news about their business, but they might also want to just universally create one piece of news or one post or one piece of content that actually gets shared across all those sites. And it's a very easy way to then do that through a multi-site setup. One way we do use it, and it's probably not a way you hear a lot about, is if you've got some clients that like to make really radical changes. In an ideal world, you'd have like a staging server that you do and then production. But if you've got a client that likes to make crazy changes to their website and they take a long time to do it, but then in the meantime they keep coming to you with annoying little updates, it makes it really hard to manage a staging and a production with that. So if we've got a client like that, we actually sometimes move them over to that and we just basically create a new site for them and let them knock themselves out. And eventually when they're finished, we'll go and clean it up, and all we've then got to redo is repoint the domain using domain mapping at the end. So it's a way that someone can go in and do a massive overhaul of a site that you can leave the client to do it, and you can still keep working on their existing site. So it's a good way of think about it with or using it for that kind of scenario. It doesn't pop up very often, but we have used it to help people do that. So I wanted to talk a bit about developing for multi-site. So ideally, before you even start developing on your multi-site from I suppose a theme point of view, you've sort of really got to think it through. Goes back to the previous presentation. Really understand how you intend to structure it, subdomain or subfolder. We typically subdomain, most of us, because ultimately we're dealing with different domain names. So we're going to use DNS mapping to repoint them. How are you going to theme it? Because we're building custom themes, generally what we look at is we typically build a master theme and we put an options panel in it. So we're usually looking at one consistent thing, and within the options panel we may offer certain variations that client can then use. If they've got a lot, you can usually get away with that if you're dealing with like a marketing manager or a head of digital, and they're like, I'm going to own it, and this is what I want, and I just want to be able to change some colors up, and I want to change, obviously different logo on each one. Fine. If you have a lot of, I suppose, state-led businesses or businesses where there's there's more than one cook, so to speak, generally you'll probably be better off with a child theme. But we try and keep it as simple as possible. Our aim is we don't want it to be complex. We're going to try and keep it down to one master theme if we can. If not, we're going to have one master base and we're going to have individual child themes in there. So from that point of view, it's sort of, for us, it's to keep it as lean as possible. We don't use pre-purchased themes. But if you were thinking of doing it, you've got to be really careful. They load a lot of crap that you don't need. Again, if you've got lots of sites on there and you're going to be loading lots of different themes, it's going to become quite resource heavy after a while. And again, that comes down to your plugins as well. And I would say be very, very selective. We try and use as few plugins as possible. The plugins we will use will be functionality for content and security and protection. We would not use a plugin for a slider or a feed from or let's add my Facebook icons. We would generally code that in there or put that in there to stop all that bulk and that load. And then the other final thing is really you've got to actually, who's going to be managing it moving forward, and can the client be trusted to look after it? And again, it just comes down to different scenarios similar to what was explained before. So from a development workflow, we really don't treat it any differently to as we would building a single site. So we're going to do a local installation, and we use Vagrant to set up. We use VVV, varying vagrants or whatever, I can't remember. We use that, and you can set up a multi-site installation with that. Generally what we do in our workflow is the actual master installation, we'll make it a dummy site that actually relates to nothing. So we typically get the client, or we'll go off and buy like a URL that's non-specific to anything, and the actual full-on core installation just does nothing. It just goes to a site that we're going to have going nowhere. We're actually going to put all their sites as sub-sites underneath. We originally started doing that because it was easier to pull them out of the site if they're not running from the master. Because so really it was, we didn't want one site all these sub-sites being beholden to one core site. So all the sites we treat completely independently of each other. So the top site is just a nothing site. It's got nothing in it. We just set it up and leave it there doing nothing. Just hide it from Google. It doesn't exist. So what we will do is make that master a dummy site. And when you're working locally, if you're using a subdomain setup like we would, when you create a new site, it's going to do the same URL setup of putting that name, dot, and whatever developer name you've given. You can make that work locally on your local machine. There's probably someone smarter than me that knows how to do it quickly. The only way I know, because I'm useless, is to open up your host file and do a manual update and add that. But you don't actually really need to do that. You could actually just open up the settings in the dashboard and treat the domain or rename the domain like it's a subfolder. So you would just go to the URL that you've set up for development, / and then whatever you've called that domain underneath, and it will just treat it as a subfolder even though it's a subdomain setup. So you can always access that way. So in regards to theme management, we develop our own things. We do that. We will submit our stuff through a Git repo that we deploy and manage all our themes, all our changes through that. We use a lot of ACF, which is Advanced Custom Fields, for those that don't know. We do use that a lot for the structure of the site, because typically what we're trying to do is find something that's universal. So we use ACF for a lot of what we call flexible build. So typically when we're doing this is not WordPress out the box. We're going to make a lot of customization. We're going to add a lot of flexible content to allow people to add video, image galleries, case studies, whatever they want to add from a content point of view, and we pretty much map that out. But the other great thing about that is when you move forward and suddenly they come back and say, hey, we really need to add this function, because it's a flexible build, you're really just adding a row of flexibility to the site. So it's quite easy to adapt and change and make different changes to that code, tweaks. Everything sort of runs independent of each other rather than using plugins. It's all sort of every element of the site from a functionality point of view, from just standard content to images to video to all that. It's an independent core function within itself, so we can change it without making massive changes across the board. So typically, as we do that, we try and keep it as universal as possible. And as I said, we build an options panel, and again, we use ACF for that options panel. And in the options panel, we're usually typically getting people to put in their logo, address details, social media links, Google Analytics code, stuff that we want to obviously share across the site where everyone wants to have something slightly unique. However, multi-sites do love to throw issues at you. They are a real pain, and migrating from local and production is a real pain, and it's really because it's just one massive, great big database. I get panicky enough migrating databases from local to staging. There's the best of times, let alone doing it for everything. Setting up a staging site, as I explained earlier, it's not always a really good option to be able to do that, because typically you don't have, if you've got a 7 gig multi-site, you don't really want to duplicate the damn thing. So it becomes really problematic once scaling gets really bad from that point. Backups are a real pain as well. There's a lot of things, I suppose the backup solutions most people use, they're not always going to work. So a lot of people use something like Backup Buddy. Backup Buddy doesn't really handle multi-site very well. Also, the problem is once it gets big, any backup you're doing, it's massive amount of data it's trying to back up, it just dies a death, typically. So there's that side of it. And then obviously at the end, you've got to think of domain mapping and record aliases if you're going to use subdomains. And for a lot of people, again, it's a bit panicky because, when you're changing things on your domains and you're mapping, it's not something that you can do and watch it happen straight away. It's the annoying thing where you do it and you might have to wait an hour to realize you've done it wrong. And then you panic at that point. So I wanted to forward some tips that I had over the years of doing this sort of stuff. So really for migrations, I call it the old-fashioned way. It actually touches exactly on what Dee said. There's nothing wrong with doing it the old-fashioned way. So we will typically pull down the database from local, and we'll do a good old-fashioned find and replace, depending on what the size is. It's a lot easier to do that. If we were doing significant changes to the website, we would actually just recreate a whole new database and import this database into it, and all we would do is change the WP config file. And if there's a complete mess up, we just change the WP config file and we've rolled straight back. So it's the quickest and it's the best and soundest way to do it without us pressing a button, deploying, overriding, and then basically panicking if it's gone horribly wrong. Typically on small updates, anything we do for a small content, we may test it locally, but we'll pretty much just do it live on the site. We won't bother even to the point, we'll just go in and we'll just manually update it as we would there. If it's a large content change, we just basically create a new site. That's one of the great things about multi-site is you can just create another site and test everything in there, and it can be just sitting there that no one else can see. If you don't map the domain, it's just a site that sits there doing nothing. All you've got to remember is, you don't want Google to stumble upon it by chance, so you just need to go into your settings and tell your settings to ignore, to tell Google, discourage Google finding it. But you can always do that. We actually use a plugin called Migrate DB Pro if we are going to do any syncing from production to our local. But all that will do, that will only ever pull down the master database. So it only ever pulls down that master. So you've still got to manually go back in afterwards and update all your settings, because it won't basically do all the updates of changing all the other names to whatever you've set up locally. So you can do that manually. To be pretty honest, we don't do a lot of pulling between. We just do it one time and we leave it there. We don't mess around much locally on the content and things. You sort of, as I said, update the settings. You've got to update your local host as well if you do that. So if you've built a new site live and then you pull it down, you have to update your local site or go through the settings process as before. So in regards to development, if we're updating a theme, what we actually do to update a theme and test a theme is we set up the theme again in a second folder. So what we would do is we would actually create another site in the multi-site, and we'll just call it our testing site. So once we make any changes, the way our process works and how we deploy is we'll make a change to a theme, we will submit. We either, depending on whether they pay or not for us to manage it, if they don't pay for us to manage it, we'll just use a gold task to deploy it via like FTP. If they do pay us to manage it, we'd probably put them on a system, or we use something like Beanstalk, which does auto deployment. So what would happen is as we make the changes to the theme, we're ready to go, we would commit those changes to Beanstalk. That would deploy it to that other theme folder on the website. We would then go into our duplicate site on the multi-site, and we would test the new theme in there. So we would look at it in a live situation. If we were like, yep, this now works, this is beautiful, we will then go basically redeploy via Beanstalk to tell it to go to production. And all that basically does is just overwrites the existing theme, which is the master. So we never do anything directly to the master file, you just basically create another theme folder, and we run it that way. So we've always got sort of one theme development, one theme production, and we just leave them on the same site. So that's like we find the best way to update the themes. Then like with backups and hosting, and they're really sort of important. For backups, we use a free plugin, actually. It's a great free plugin called WordPress Backup to Dropbox plugin. If you've got money, or if the client's spending a lot of money, I would just pay to back up at the server side or get yourself some decent hosting. As I said, a lot of premium backup tools don't work. WordPress, which is I think is an automatic one, is an option. But with all of them, you're going to pay per site for something like WordPress, whereas the Dropbox one will just upload the whole thing. But at the same time, these things can be quite resource heavy if your site's massive. So generally I'd recommend, or what we do is just find a decent host. So if you've got someone, you've got your own if you're a good systems admin, you get yourself your own VPS. As long as you know what you're doing, you can run it from there. Typically nowadays, we don't even bother with that anymore. We just send them down premium WordPress, and we use Flywheel for a few multi-sites here and there. Again, a lot of the premium WordPress people won't touch it either. So Flywheel will, and they're pretty good. So we send it, and again, that's backing up every day. So it's just as part of their process. So it's pretty good. Generally for performance and stuff, you want to use a decent caching tool. We use, if we're not on a premium host, if it's on a VPS, we'll use WP Rocket, and what we'll do is we'll integrate that with Cloudflare as well. And I would definitely look into a CDN of some sort. And again, if you're on a premium host, sometimes you can pay for that. If you want to do it on a bit of a budget, Delicious Brains do a great plugin called WP Offload S3, and we use that on Amazon Web Services. I think it's CloudFront, and it's pretty cheap, pretty reasonable. The plugin itself is not cheap; it's about $200. I say $200 a year is nothing, is it really? But the actual Amazon for a CDN is actually pretty good, and we can deploy that, and that's just really to cut down on load, because typically what we find is a lot of multi-sites, and this sometimes with the thought process is someone puts like their big business site on there, and then they want all these other little business sites, and the big business is taking up probably 70% of the traffic. And when that spikes, it can kill everything else. So you've got to sort of be a bit careful on those things. Also, in regards to, I suppose, performance, like the caching is really, really important, because, WordPress gets attacked a lot. So if it's getting attacked and things are sucking into it, it will die on certain sites quite quickly. If someone does something stupid on their website, they can die. And I haven't mentioned it here, but you probably want to look at a good image compression tool. Kraken is a great plugin. I know the guys from WP Rocket do one as well. You can do them, but again, you've got to be careful, because sometimes they time out your server as well. So not everyone will allow it, because sometimes they time out through the process, but definitely look at an image compression tool just to keep the size down. So some of the useful plugins that we use, and some of these plugins are fantastic actually. Obviously, if you're doing a subdomain setup, you really need WordPress MU domain mapping, which is the #1 plugin you need for that, and that makes it very, very simple for you to manage your sites and map your domain. If you've got multiple users, we use 2 main plugins on that, and that's Multisite User Management, and basically that enables you don't have to add the users per site. You can add a user and actually specify all the sites you want them to manage from that point of view. Typically for us, we're not dealing often with a huge amount of users, probably wouldn't be more than 40 on a multi-site install, but we find that typically on a lot of them, we've got like 3 marketing people, and they want access across like 7 sites. So we use that to set them up across 7 sites, really easy. And we use unconfirmed, because the downside of multi-site installation, when you send off the invitation, they actually have to accept to join. rather than in WordPress, if you bring on a new user, they get a nice email saying, hey, you've been registered for this site. Here's the login and here's your password, and off you go. With Multisite, it doesn't quite, I'm doing this off the top of my head, so correct me if I'm wrong, anyone. From memory, I think it just sends you basically an email saying, hey, you've been invited to join this network. And a lot of people don't know what the hell that means. They don't click on the link. So unconfirmed actually tells us who's gone through that process. So we're not going to manually go through and check who's actually decided to join, because those users will sit in the background whether they've registered or not. So unconfirmed will tell you, which is a great little plugin. Cloning sites is something you'll do quite a lot. So we use Multisite Clone Duplicator. It's fantastic. So we use that for testing. So if we're going to make a massive change to one site, we'll just clone the thing. Just clone it, set it up, leave it sitting there in a domain. Once we've made the changes to that, if we do all the changes to that, or the client does any changes to that, what we'll do is we'll just remap the domain to that site once we're ready to roll. So what we sometimes do with websites is their domain, as we set them up, might be their company name 2015 dot whatever that domain name we've bought for them is. And then what we'll do is we'll do that site 2016. They can go in, do whatever they want, and then we just wait. So you can do that sort of thing. So it's a great way of like managing site at that point that way. For content management, a lot of them, as I said before, they like to share information across their site. So there is a multi-site post duplicator, and it should be post and page because it works for everything. And basically what happens is if you are an editor on the site, when you go to create that content, it just basically loads up in the WordPress editor screen, and you can tick the other sites that you want it to also be posted on. But you can also select it just to go there in draft mode. So what you can do is you can either publish it live, or you could have someone come in, do a piece of content, tick all the other sites. As soon as they hit it, it's going to go to all the others. And it's a great little tool for people that want to do things quickly. And then we sort of we have played around with network shared media, but it's a bit sketchy at times, to be honest. But that's a way of basically being able to share your media library. To be honest, in my experience, not many people actually share the media library. People like to put their own sort of spin on things. So even though we do it, we just let them upload the images. The shared library sometimes. Look, if you're worried about resources and sites, it's a good little thing. And then security. Security is really important on the site. We just use a really lightweight plugin called Login Security Solution. And that's just a simple repeller if anyone tries to log in or crack the site. Some of the bigger sites we do have the full security plugins on, like iTheme Security or WordFence. They're pretty good, but I have a love-hate relationship with security plugins because they're great, but they have a tendency to destroy websites at the same time, as in they'll time you out really quickly. So if you get under a really aggressive attack, they're just going to kill your resources and kill your site. So sometimes just having something lightweight that pings away, that's why actually we use Cloudflare a bit more from the server side to sort of prevent them from doing that. And then this is a final thing really to think about, is sort of where people know it's the htaccess file. And it's quite important to remember, like, you may mess around with it, you may not, but that one htaccess file is controlling everything. So you've got to be really careful of messing around with it. We have had instances where a site on our staging server got hacked in Multisite, and they messed up the htaccess, and it does take everything down. It will take all the sites down. So it becomes quite problematic rebuilding because of that one site. And also, and Chris will correct me if I'm wrong because he's an SEO expert, but when you're doing things like 301s, it's not the same process on a multi-site. You've actually got to specify what the site is for, because you can't exactly go in there and say about redirect to another page, because it's going to go, well, what page? I've got 7, 8 sites under here. I'm going to redirect. It's going to redirect everything with a URL of about to it. So you've got to be very specific about the site you're dealing with, and you've actually got to specify. I think in the example I put S2, but that would specify that the rewrite rule is only 2 for the rewrite condition you've put. So if you had like 400 301s for a big site, you'd have to do S equals 400 and put them all under there. But you've got to do that site by site. So again, that file can get a bit out of control if you're in the SEO stuff. And that is it. Thank you. Any questions? All right, so the question is the size of the database. I'd have to be honest, I don't look at the really big, difficult ones.
Too terrifying.
Matt does it. Matt does it in the business. Look, the biggest one we've got gets up to about 7. The whole site gets to about 7 gig. I mean, they can get really difficult to deal with just through sheer size. To be honest, that installation, if we'd ever built it, we just manage it. Had we been there at the time, we wouldn't have put them all together, because they've got one site that generates everything, and then the other sub-sites, they're not really doing a huge amount. So in an instance like that, you'd actually have been better off putting that entire site on its own VPS and put the others on a multi-site. But look, the database, it can get huge, which is why it becomes problematic with backing up. Best thing when it's big is just pay, if you've got a VPS, you just pay whoever provides that to back it up every day. You just basically have to eat the cost.
Any other caching plugins apart from that?
I mean,
Try W3 total cache or anything?
yeah, you can try the other ones. I just prefer Rocket. I loved Total Cache for a while, but then it just kept bugging me every 5 seconds. That was a great plugin, but it just sort of wound me up a bit in the end. I just ended up going down the Rocket route. It just through testing, it ended up really, really basically killing some of the other things. And the integration with CloudFront, or Cloudflare, sorry. I'm getting those, too many clouds. That integration's great as well, because basically what we'll do is we'll run the domains through that to protect it for security, and then still run the caching through. And you can do it with just their free account.
Do you end up paying for the pro Cloudflare at all?
The bigger sites, yeah, we will. If they get pinged, it's mainly because they're getting pinged. I mean, look, it depends on how you set up. Some of the sites get hit a lot. It's the VPS. You just never know. I mean, it's just security. I mean, we had one VPS that we suddenly noticed whilst we were doing something. There was like a 1.5 gig file on there. There was something from China doing something, and we're just like, what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? You just can't. You're never going to prevent it completely. You're just looking to make it difficult.